Let's begin discussing Ecology Part 2. The term interdependence explains pretty much the entire theme of ecology. Inter meaning within, and dependence meaning obviously to depend on. So we're going to discuss how living things depend not only on each other, but they also depend on abiotic factors in order for survival. So where does interdependence actually happen? It happens in any local environment that living and non-living things live. So we have two of the terms which we've already introduced in class, biotic and abiotic factors. These factors depend on each other in order for survival. Bio meaning life, so the term biotic means living. These are all the plants, the animals, and bacteria that live in a particular environment. Abiotic, remember when you put an A in front of word, it makes it the opposite. So these are non-living factors such as temperature, soil, sunlight, water, moisture, air currents, anything that that particular environment has that is non-living. Within these environments, living organisms need to also acquire a habitat. And a habitat is a specific place in the environment that an organism lives. A habitat can be in one ecosystem or it could be in many ecosystems. An example of an organism that has many ecosystems as its habitat would be birds that migrate south or north for the winter. Species that have their habitats, they include biotic factors and abiotic elements. So there may be certain organisms, like frogs, that need to live near the water. That would be an abiotic element. Or we also have a frog that can need to live on a lily pad. And lily pad itself would be a biotic factor. Within each habitat, an organism needs to fulfill a role. Depending on the habitat that it's in, the role may change. We call this role a niche, and a niche describes the summary of everything an organism does in the habitat that it's in. An organism niche can be affected by both its tolerance, which means how well it can adapt to changes, and the competitive interactions. So how high is competition in that habitat? So let's just take for an example humans, because obviously we can relate to humans because we are humans. Humans are composed in a classroom, correct? When we are sitting in the classroom, I'm a human, but my role is a teacher. You are also a human, but in the classroom, your role is a student. Now let's just say you change your habitat. So the habitat at that point would be the classroom. Let's just say we change the habitat to your home. At that point, your role is no longer a student, but you may be a brother or a sister or a son or a daughter. So depending on what habitat an organism lives in, its niche or role will change. As stated before, niches or roles are determined by how well an organism adapts, which is considered to be its tolerance, or the limiting factors that surround that habitat. So a limiting factor is pretty much self-explanatory, a factor that limits the amount of productivity or the amount of food that that particular organism can obtain. So examples of limiting factors is the amount of water, amount of food, temperature, predators versus prey, which again relates to the amount of food, and also shelter. When many organisms are seeking for the same thing, whether it's resources such as food, or light, or water, or space in terms of their habitat, the more organisms that are competing for that space, we say that the competition is high. Therefore, that limiting factor increases, and it makes it harder for one organism to live in that particular habitat. Tolerance, as stated before, is how well an organism can adapt to certain factors such as competition. So if an organism has high tolerance, then it would make it easier for them because they have a higher adaptation rate in order to stay in that habitat. An organism that has a lower tolerance rate would not be able to survive as well because it can't adapt as well to the changes in that environment. Therefore, they would try to find another habitat with less competition. Relationships that organisms can have can sometimes be beneficial, sometimes they're harmful, and sometimes they're just indifferent. We call these relationships symbiotic. The first type of symbiosis is called commensalism, the second is called parasitism, and the third is called mutualism. The first type of symbiosis that we're going to discuss is called commensalism, and this is a symbiotic relationship where one species is benefiting from the relationship and the other is unaffected. So let's take the example here of the tree frog. The tree frog in this relationship is going to benefit because the plants and the leaves are going to give the tree frog a habitat. It's going to keep it sheltered. But the leaf itself is not going to be affected at all because the tree isn't harming it and it's not helping it. The second symbiotic relationship is called parasitism, where we have a parasite-host relationship. The parasite is going to be the species that benefits from the relationship, and the host is going to be the one that is either harmed or killed in the relationship. Examples of parasites would be ticks, fleas, lice, bedbugs, and tapeworms. So in a parasitic relationship, the host is going to be harmed or to the point where it can be killed. You have a lack of nutrients from the host. Sometimes there can be an exchange of bacterial infections, and there are other times when certain parasites like the tapeworm can cause obstructions in certain organs, causing pain, discomfort, and even death. Whereas the parasite itself is taking the nutrients from the host and they're not exchanging any type of bacteria for their benefit, and therefore they are going to get absolutely everything that they need from the host and they don't have to do any of the dirty work. A symbiotic relationship called mutualism is a beneficial relationship for both species. So the examples that we have here is a bee with flowers, and we also have cleaning birds on rhinos. So we'll start with the rhino first. The rhino is going to give the cleaning birds free transportation, therefore benefiting the birds. And while the birds are on the back of the rhino, they're going to pick the little insects off them. So not only are the birds getting food, but now the rhino is also getting a clean back. It doesn't have to be bothered by the insects, and also doesn't have to clean the skin off themselves. Over here, the mutualistic relationship is that the bee is going to eat the nectar from the flower, and when it does that, the pollen from the flower rubs all over the hair of the bee, and when it goes from flower to flower, it's going to pollinate take the pollen from there and pollinate all the other flowers with the pollen from that original flower. So just an overall look here at the symbiotic relationships. Each dot here represents a different organism that's part of the relationship. In commensalism, no one is harmed, one species benefits, and the other is unaffected. If we look at parasitism, the host is harmed and or killed, and the other species, which is going to be the parasite, is going to benefit fully. Nobody is unaffected. Mutualism, they both benefit, no one is harmed, and no one is unaffected. The last topic in ecology is succession. And succession is the gradual sequence of regrowth in an area. So you always start off with areas that have exposed rocks and no shrubbery or plants or animals, and slowly over time, over long periods of time, you get to what we call the climax community, which is the largest amount of biodiversity that a particular ecosystem can hold. But we have two types of succession, and the first type is called primary succession. Primary succession is where you have an area that has absolute bare rock, and over millions and millions of years, or hundreds and hundreds of years, hundreds and hundreds of years will turn into a large forest. So the way that this happens is that we have organisms called moss and lichen, L-I-C-H-E-N, very similar to moss. And what they do is they grab a hold of bare rock and they are going to slowly turn that rock into soil. They break down that hard rock and they turn it into soil. And once they have soil, this is where nutrients are able to be, absorbed and given in from the death of the moss and the lichen. And once we start to gain more and more nutrients, we'll start to see little grasses. And then once we see little grasses, when those little grasses die and they return more nutrients to the soil, we'll start to see little shrubs with the little grasses. Over time, we'll see little trees, and then before you know it, we'll have what we call a climax community, which is the largest amount of biodiversity, which is plants and animals, that that particular ecosystem can hold. The second type of succession is called secondary succession, in which we already have soil present when we have to start the process of regrowth. Typically, this happens to an area that has already reached the climax community stage and some type of natural disaster occurred. Maybe something like a forest fire or a tornado, hurricane, or even after plowing. So you don't have to go through the stages of the moss and the lichen breaking down the rock because you already have soil and you already have a lot of nutrients from whatever died either in the fire or, like I said, a natural disaster of some sort. All of those things are going to decompose, right? All those living things have nutrients, they have carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, hydrogen, all those good elements that we need in order to be recycled. So all those nutrients are going to go into the ground. You're going to have your small grasses. Over time, they die. You're going to have your little shrubs, and then you'll start to see, the larger shrubs, the smaller trees, and then eventually you'll reach your climax community. Secondary succession takes a lot less time to get to the climax community because you already have a head start because the soil is already present.